Should you drink a cup of melted lard in the morning, or should you drink a cup of macadamia nut oil in the morning? I mean, there's your answer right there. It's kind of funny to see how things have evolved. A fat is a fat is a fat. Doesn't really matter. Fats are fats, right? Well, that used to kind of be the thought process behind carbohydrates too, right? A carb is a carb is a carb, but I think most of us now know that not all carbs are created equal, right? There's a glycemic index scale. There's some carbs that are high glycemic and some carbs that are low glycemic. Some carbs that are good for you, some carbs that are bad for you. Well, the same thing comes into question with fats, right? Which fats are good, which fats are bad, and how do they digest and how do they affect us? So should you be eating cuts of meat that have copious amounts of fat on it, or should you be eating leaner cuts of meat? And I'm going to address the three common sort of discussions and even arguments that come through this. Now, I'm going to come right out and share my opinion, but it's just my opinion. Okay, I'm some guy on the internet. Sure, I've had success with my diet. Sure, a lot of people like to watch my videos, but at the end of the day, you have to do what works for you. But anyhow, I am a fan of consuming leaner cuts of meat and adding my fats in from sources that I can control. Now, let me tell you the main reason behind this, and it has nothing to do with the quality of fats per se. The primary reason is this. If you take two of the exact same cuts of high-fat meat, say you take 1 6-ounce ribeye from one store and 1 6-ounce ribeye from another store, there's a very good chance that the amount of fat in each ribeye is going to be significantly different, right? Like one might have a thick ribbon of fat, one might have a thin ribbon of fat, and it's not always easy to see with the naked eye. So the bottom line is the delta between the two can be significantly higher than you think. One might have 20 grams of fat and another might have 40 grams of fat, right? And it really is kind of difficult to see. And at the end of the day, fat yields 9 calories per gram. So every time we have, 5 or 10 extra grams of fat that we don't know are there or we think it's about right, we're talking a copious amount of calories that can throw us off. So my primary reason for usually going leaner cuts of meat is because I can control the fat that I am getting into my body in terms of quantity easier. Now, full and separate aside from anything else. Hey, so the quantity of fats can make a big difference in how much we consume, like calories at the end of the day. But let's talk about another piece of the equation, okay? Let's say, for example, you cannot get your hands on super high quality meat. Well, we do know that a lot of times the omega-6 fatty acids that are going to be in meat are obviously going to be in the fat, right? Typically, when you're doing keto or just in general, it's better to keep your omega-6 profile a little bit lower. Now, there is the argument that when you go for like a good quality grass-fed, grass-finished meat, you're going to have better profiles of omega-3s. But let's address the elephant in the room here. Okay, the omega-3 content of meat is negligible to begin with. Granted, having good amounts of omega-3 in your land-based meat is a good thing. It's better than omega-6 is. But even a quote-unquote high omega-3 rich meat is going to be not that much omega-3s. And the omega-3s that are in it are usually what is called ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, which has to go through a pretty rigorous conversion process in your body to become a usable form of omega-3 to begin with. Is that saying that grass-fed, grass-finished is bad? No, heck no. Okay, you are getting much, in my opinion, you are getting a much better tasting meat and a much better fatty acid profile, in my opinion, right? Now, there's a lot of evidence that kind of suggests both directions, but when you're consuming a lot of grain-fed meat, you don't necessarily know what is going into the fat. It can be a little bit more difficult to control, right? So my reasoning behind leaner cuts of meat is it allows me to control the fats that I am bringing in, right? So again, let's say we take 2 different cuts of meat, okay, or the same cut of meat, excuse me, 2 ribeyes again. One comes from one farm, one comes from another. We don't really know what the fatty acid profile is. There's no way for us to really know. We don't really know exactly what those cows are eating. So it's questionable what kind of fat we are getting in, right? So that leads us to, well, okay, maybe it's better to be able to have a leaner cut of meat and then cook with the kind of fats or add the kind of fats that we want to control. I do not care if you're using some kind of nut oil or a macadamia nut oil or a plant-based oil or using ghee or using good quality lard. What I care about is that you are in control of A, how much fat you're putting on it, but B, the kind of fat. There are times where I don't want to have a lot of saturated fat. So it makes way more sense for me to have that lean filet and then maybe drizzle a little bit of avocado oil on it, or cook it with a little avocado oil, or cook it with a little bit of macadamia nut oil, right? That way I'm getting my fats, but I'm able to measure, and I'm able to see, okay, I want a polyunsaturated fat right now. I want a monounsaturated fat. Oh, I do want a saturated fat, but at least I want to control what kind of saturated fat I get. It's not saying that eating a fatty cut of meat is bad. I'm not saying that. I just mean if you want utter control over your diet, it makes a lot of sense, okay? You can choose, and don't get me wrong, I will choose a fatty cut of meat now and then. And when you look at grass-fed, grass-finished meat, a lot of times even the fattier cuts are leaner. So like a grass-fed, grass-finished beef is generally, you're probably gonna find is leaner than a more feedlot-oriented beef, right, in the same cut. By the way, in terms of shopping for beef and meat, I recommend ButcherBox down below. So whether you're going for a fatty cut or a lean cut, they are utilizing grass-fed, grass-finished meat, and I'm a big fan of them. They are a big sponsor and supporter of this channel and have been for, I think they're like the oldest sponsor on my channel. In fact, the very first sponsor video I ever did on my channel was with them because I trusted them. So there is a link down below in the description. That way you can get meat delivered to your doorstep. And there's also a link so that you can check out the kinds of meat that I like my favorites list and things like that. So that link is down below in the description, and you can get meat delivered to your doorstep. Fatty cuts, lean cuts, fish, chicken, you name it, all through ButcherBox. So again, thank you ButcherBox, and make sure you check them out down below using that special link. People out there on the internet are saying that lean meat is going to spike your insulin and cause a problem. So in the world of like insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity and all that, somewhere along the lines, it's become a little bit viral that, well, okay, if you eat lean meat, you're gonna have a big insulin spike. I've talked about this in other videos, but maybe you haven't seen those, so let's address it here. Any kind of insulin spike that you have from meat, whether it is coming from a lean meat, which yes, it is going to be higher, or from a fatty cut of meat, and yes, it is going to be lower because the fat's gonna slow down the digestion. It doesn't matter. It is a moot point. It is irrelevant because protein spikes glucagon too, and your insulin-glucagon ratio stays the same. So I'll break it down really quick. When you consume protein, it spikes your insulin so that the protein can get into storage. Okay, the protein needs to get into the cell to allow muscle protein synthesis to occur. This is very important. Well, that requires insulin, right? So the insulin spikes so the protein can come in. But you always have blood sugar. Like blood sugar never goes to zero, you'd be dead. So your blood sugar is circulating. So then what happens when the insulin spikes? Uh-oh, blood glucose drops. And if we didn't have a glucagon response along with it, you would go hypoglycemic every time you ate protein. Okay, so if that theory is true, that every time you eat lean protein, you spike your insulin, you would be going hypoglycemic. So you have a glucagon response, which opposes insulin. We always want glucagon in the fat loss world. Glucagon is the opposite of insulin and stimulates hormone-sensitive lipase, and it stimulates fat loss to occur, okay? So when we consume protein, insulin goes up, but immediately upon the insulin going up, glucagon goes up too, to prevent your blood sugar from dropping too much, therefore keeping you at the same insulin to glucagon ratio. So it does not affect fat loss. It does not affect any of that negatively. So whether it's happening with a big sharp spike with a lean chicken breast or a lean piece of cod, or it's happening with a gentle bell curve with a fatty ribeye, it's the same thing. The insulin and the glucagon are going up at the same time. So you can throw that whole myth aside. But you do have to decide. Okay, and one more thing I just want to throw out there, and this is a little bit of an urban legend, but there is some truth to it. If there are a lot of antibiotics and nasty things in meat, there is a good likelihood that it could be stored in the fat. Now, there are some studies that look at this, and the bottom line is if there's a bunch of antibiotics and a bunch of garbage in the meat, it's going to be in the meat, period, right? Not just in the fat. But when you're looking at the big equation, there's a likelihood that it could store more in the fat. We see that at least in humans, right? We end up storing some of those negative things in our fat. And there's one other thing I want to leave you with, okay? And that is something I've been talking about a lot recently, is that really only 20 to 30% of your fat calories for the day should be coming from saturated fat. If you start eating so much in the way of just high saturated fat content, you do deprive yourself from the poly and the monounsaturated fats that would allow you to get more of, well, what is called a ligand for PPAR, getting fat adapted. Okay, we don't want to have just a bunch of saturated fat. Now, if you're someone that does carnivore, which I'm sure there are plenty of you, that's fine. But you may want to consider also adding in a copious amount of fish so that you're at least not only getting saturated fat, you're getting some polyunsaturated fats as well. Now, pork is a great source of monounsaturated fat. So there is a way to do it on carnivore by getting this rotation with the right fatty acids. I just don't want to see anyone falling victim to just having saturated fat because it is occupying precious space in which you could be getting good nutrition from other kinds of fats, whether they are plant-based or animal-based, I don't really care. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.